In the last 20 years, the vast majority of countries around the world have adopted counterterrorism legislation that has increased the number of children who are being detained for national security offenses. This legislation often fails to distinguish between children and adults. They include overly broad definitions of terrorism. They often include harsher penalties and fewer procedural guarantees. The research that we've conducted for the study indicates that at least 30 countries are detaining children for national security offenses. Many countries have adopted counterterrorism laws that are so broad that children are being detained for peaceful activity. In Algeria, for example, terrorism is defined as any act which aims to affect the normal functioning of institutions. Or in Malaysia, the law says that terrorism includes acts that are intended to influence the government to do any act. These laws can criminalize children for their freedom of assembly and freedom of expression. So, for example, in Egypt, over 3,000 children have been arrested and detained simply for protesting against the government or for affiliation with the Muslim Brotherhood. Similarly, in Ethiopia, hundreds of children have been detained for participating in anti-government protests. Some countries have also criminalized what we call apology for terrorism. And these have been used to detain and prosecute children for online activity, including posts on Facebook or on Twitter. For example, in France, a 16-year-old boy was arrested for posting on Facebook a cartoon that was related to the attack on Charlie Hebdo cartoonists. Some violent extremist groups, like ISIS, for example, use the internet as a means of recruitment and for propaganda purposes. And as a result, some children engage in communications or conversations online and then become influenced to take part in violent activities, even though they're far from an actual conflict. So, for example, in the United States, a high school student began studying Islam online and then began communicating with supporters of ISIS. He became very active on Twitter, posting tweets encouraging financial support for ISIS, and he's now serving 10 years in prison. Counterterrorism laws have also made child detention more likely. Some countries have lowered the age for prosecution for terrorism. So children may be prosecuted at a younger age for a terrorism-related crime than for another kind of offense. Some states have also extended the length of time that someone can be detained before being charged. So, for example, Afghanistan allows authorities to detain anyone likely to commit a national security offense for an indefinite period. Some countries are also using anti-terrorism legislation for other purposes. So, for example, El Salvador uses its anti-terrorism law to prosecute children for suspected gang activity. Many countries have criminalized mere membership or association in terrorist or violent extremist groups, even if a child has not committed any violent offenses. So, for example, in Iraq, hundreds of children have been convicted of terrorism for association with ISIS, even without any evidence of actual violent activities. In the context of counterterrorism, children are also being prosecuted in military or adult courts and receiving harsh sentences as a result. For example, in Cameroon and in Israel and in Thailand, national security cases are usually tried in military, not civilian courts. In Egypt, at least 150 children have been sentenced in military courts for participation in protests or supporting the Muslim Brotherhood. Many countries have also increased the sentences for terrorism or national security offenses. So, for example, both Morocco and Algeria have doubled sentences for terrorism-related crimes versus other offenses. Some countries allow the death penalty, even though this is strictly prohibited by international law. And in many cases, counterterrorism laws don't distinguish between adults and children, creating a confusion over which law is to be used, a counterterrorism law or a juvenile justice law, in a case where a child is being charged. Clearly, many children are facing punitive and excessive measures that often violate international standards. Changes in counterterrorism laws and measures have eroded some of the important principles around child rights, specifically the principle that children who are recruited by armed groups are primarily victims that are entitled to rehabilitation and reintegration. Increasingly, we're seeing a double standard, where in traditional armed conflicts, child soldiers are given assistance for their recovery and reintegration, while in conflicts with so-called terrorist or armed extremist groups, children are instead treated with prosecution and prison. So going forward, there are several things that are very important. Number one is that a child should never be criminalized simply for their membership in an armed group or a violent extremist group. Secondly, states need to review their counterterrorism legislation and bring it into line with international juvenile justice standards and the rights of the child. Third, if a child is to be prosecuted for a national security offense, juvenile justice standards always need to apply, including the principle of detention as a last resort. And then finally, for all children accused of a national security offense, the priority has to be their recovery and their reintegration. The real focus of prosecution should be on the recruiters that exploit them in the first place.